We are broadcasting a special episode from Netroots Nation 2016 in St. Louis, Missouri. And joining us now is Jaime Raskin. Jaime is a constitutional law professor at American University and is also a candidate for Congress in Maryland. He has just completed and won the Democratic primary. That it was, in fact, I believe, the most expensive congressional primary in history. Is that, first of all,
not
welcome.
Because of me. Well, thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
First
I
of
wasn't
all,
the one who
welcome.
spent all the money, but we raised $2 million. But one of my opponents spent, I think it was $14 or $15 million.
Wow.
David Trone, and then another, Kathleen Matthews, spent $3 million. So we were outspent, 8 or 9 to 1 by the other candidates.
So let's talk about that for a second, if you would, because as we were chatting a little bit before we began to roll tape, as they say euphemistically now, and it struck me that this is a model of a new form of campaigning. Obviously, you didn't. Now, your district is suburban Washington, D.C. It includes parts of, if I recall correctly, Silver Spring. Where else?
It's Montgomery County,
it's
minus
Montgomery.
a few parts. So it's Bethesda, Kensington, Chevy Chase, Silver Spring, Tacoma Park, Wheaton, Cabin John, Glen Echo, Rockville, and it goes up. It sweeps in most of Frederick County except for the city of Frederick, and also Carroll County, most of Carroll County, which is the most conservative county in all of Maryland.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you have a great geographic breadth. You have a couple of fairly expensive media markets there in Washington, D.C., and Baltimore, I guess, would be overlapping too. So reason why I bring it up is that I think it's interesting. We hear a lot of people say, well, you can't win a congressional campaign now without the big money. Just as we heard people say before Bernie Sanders, you can't be a presidential primary contender without the big money. Yet somehow you managed to do that. And what do you think the key is to
well, the internet helps a lot
like
because we had more than 15,000 donors, which I think was maybe more than any congressional campaign in the country. Progressives will come to the aid of the campaign. Progressives, they're not going to write you a max out check the way that CEOs do, but they will send you $75 or $100 to keep things going if they understand that you've got a progressive campaign and you're standing on principle. I said when I first announced I'm not taking any money from big oil, big gas, or big coal. Now, they didn't want to give me any money anyway, to be clear, but so it wasn't a big sacrifice. But it sent the message about what kind of campaign we're running.
And if you had shown a certain moral elasticity, let's say in private meetings, they might have changed their mind and been willing to give you money. And I do think that happens sometimes. So people responded to that. Nevertheless, of course, as you were saying, you were outspent by major multiples. So what made the difference? Was it door knocking, grassroots volunteerism? Was it just the nature of your message? Was it a couple things together? Why do you think you were able to pull it out despite the overwhelming difference?
Well, I think it was two main things. One is that I've been a state senator for a decade, and as well as a professor of constitutional law for a quarter of a century. And so I've got a public record. I led the floor fight for marriage equality, to abolish the death penalty, to restore voting rights to ex-felons, for the Green Maryland Act, for dramatic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. And my two leading opponents, who spent millions of dollars, had never served in public office and had no real public record, and actually both of them, had mixed giving records where they gave money to both Democrats and Republicans. I presented a very clean alternative to the public of somebody devoted to progressive movements and progressive change.
Yeah, and you also, I don't know where they stood. You have a strong record on a couple hot-button issues with most people, not just progressives, actually, but especially progressives. One of them is Social Security. I don't know where your opponents stood on that one, but you're on record as wanting to expand Social Security.
Absolutely, to strengthen and expand Social Security. But, the other part of it was that we ran a very dynamic, vibrant grassroots campaign. And so we were outspent, 15 or 20 to 1 on TV. I mean, TV was not where we were going to get votes. We were knocking on doors, and we knocked on more than 33,000 doors. We had 169 events in people's backyards and in their living rooms, and it was a real grassroots campaign. And it was exhausting, but people could tell the difference. And in the end, we just had this, enormous popular outpouring for a progressive candidacy.
See, this, and again, we're talking with Democratic congressional candidate Jaime Raskin, and I'm sorry, I forget the number of your district. It's Maryland's...
It's the 8th Congressional.
8th Congressional District. And I used to live in it for 10 years, but I somehow blanked on the name. Then let's see, what I'd like to see is a Democratic Party where the majority, if not all congressional candidates, look a lot like you. I mean, in terms of
they don't have to look like me, but maybe they could sound a little bit more like me.
That have your positions, have campaigns like yours, candidacies like yours, and that's why it's of great interest to me. Let me pivot for a second, if you would, and just say, if we had, in a world where Democrats control Congress once again, and progressive Democrats, what would you see the ideals or the values or the key policy goals of that kind of revitalized Democratic Party?
There are various emergencies confronting American society. One is related to gun violence, which is consuming a lot of communities on a daily basis, and then traumatizing the country and young people with these spectacular acts of mass shooting that are taking place around the country. So it's a lethal threat to our public. I mean, to the extent that we have a social contract and we want to stand by it, we cannot allow the gun violence to continue. So in Maryland, we banned military-style assault weapons. We imposed fingerprint licensing for gun purchases. We toughened up on inspections so we could crack down on the bad apple gun dealers who are dealing directly in the criminal underground. We need a universal background check. These are all common sense efforts that don't touch anybody's Second Amendment rights, even under the most aggressive understanding of what the Second Amendment says. Right. So that's number one. Number two is in the big picture, we've got to deal with climate change and break from carbon economics and carbon politics. This is a civilizational emergency that we're in. We just experienced the hottest June on record. Right. The last 13 months have been the hottest 13 months on record. So we got to take that seriously, and we need dramatic action to lead the world on that. Those are two things that come to mind immediately, but we need serious campaign finance reform. We've got to figure out a way to reverse Citizens United, either through a new Supreme Court justice, which obviously has been stymied by the Republicans, or else by amending the Constitution.
See, I want to talk to you. Let's talk about that for a second, if we may. And again, we're talking with Democratic congressional candidate Jaime Raskin. To me, it seems, and you're a constitutional law professor as well as a candidate, so you're the perfect person to talk to about this with. I would say, I believe that somehow overthrowing Citizens United, which my former boss Bernie Sanders said a lot, you've said a lot. To me, that's shorthand for something that I think is even more fundamental. I think the system was broken before Citizens United and before the McCutcheon ruling and a couple other rulings. I personally feel, but I love your thoughts on this, when I think of a vision of a renewed political process in this country, I think we've got to get large sums of money out of the political process altogether, which is not where we were even before Citizens United. But love your thoughts on that. I'd like publicly funded elections.
Yeah, well, but that might mean infusing large sums of money into the political process to people who don't have access to it. So it's not the money itself that's the problem. It's the maldistribution of the money and the source of the money, which then disables certain kinds of public policy action. Right. This is why, I said I'm not taking any money from the carbon industry, because we need to break from the carbon industry. We need, to move to 100% renewable energy in America as quickly as possible if we have any hope of, restraining the rise in the temperature to 2 degrees Celsius by 2050, which is what the scientists say is an absolute necessity if we're going to survive.
Right. Well, I couldn't agree more. So to me, that means getting dark money out of politics, overturning Citizens United, maybe capping individual contributions at $100, and publicly funding matching funds or something else. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the most viable immediate goals are to pass a small donor public financing regime that allows other people to get into the game.
Right.
And again, I'm speaking as somebody who's been outspent in every competitive election I've ever had. You don't need to spend more than the big money candidates. You just need enough to get your message out to your people and organize. And then you turn the big money against them. You say, fine, we're the small money campaign. We're the small money party, and we'll let the big money interests lose because it will come down to votes in the final analysis. So that's number one. Number two is we got to reverse Citizens United, because the CEOs can now write checks on the corporate treasury when that's not why the money was there. I mean, the McDonald's Corporation has billions of dollars in its treasury, not because people support the political program of McDonald's, but it's because people eat French fries.
Right.
And so, and this was an article of faith, not just among liberal but conservative justices, that you shouldn't be able to convert economic power into political power in that way. So we need to roll the clock back on what that radical decision in 2010 did.
Well, I couldn't agree more, and I think I'd like to flip from having said that I want to talk about a positive vision for the future. We can't let this day go by without mentioning the fact that apparently Donald Trump has chosen his running mate, and it's Indiana Governor Mike Pence. He was around Washington. It's interesting because Trump is running as the anti-Washington candidate. Pence was around Washington for a long time. I believe he was budget director at one point, as well as a member of Congress, and then governor of Indiana. Privatized, did a lot of privatizing as governor of Indiana, and also has a record of, I believe, supporting anti-gay discrimination.
Yeah,
he
well,
wouldn't
he's a
characterize
leader.
it that way, but
yeah. No, but he's a leader of this movement to say that private restaurants and hotels and motels and so on should not have to serve gay weddings, gay couples, gay people if they don't want to. And of course, that just takes us back to the period of history pre-Civil Rights Act of 1964. Right. That was exactly the argument that was made during the Civil Rights Movement, which is why should these lunch counters in hotels and motels be forced to serve African-American people if they don't want to? And what Congress said, and the Supreme Court upheld it, was that if you're in the stream of commerce, you can be subject to laws governing public accommodations, and you can't discriminate. I mean, that was a really important moment in American history when we said that when people cross state lines, or even if they're within one state their whole life, but they go to a business establishment, they go to an amusement park, they go to a hotel, motel, restaurant, they can't be discriminated against.
Right.
And now suddenly the Republicans want to turn the clock back on that.
Right. I mean, well said. I always suggest that people substitute black for gay when they're talking about, or think about, should somebody be able not to bake a wedding cake for an interracial couple or an interfaith couple?
Yeah.
As a child of an interfaith couple myself, I know that there was a time when that was subject to enormous
Although on that point we should be, I was the floor leader for marriage equality in Maryland, which we passed about a year before the Supreme Court rendered its decision. If you get one person who's just an individual who bakes cakes, they can bake cakes for whoever they want and whoever they don't want to. They're not a public establishment.
Right.
And so they're not governed by things like the Civil Rights Act of 64 or local and state civil rights ordinances. But once you become a corporation or you're a place of public accommodation, you're big enough, you have several employees and so on, then Giant Food and Safeway Food can't discriminate against gay couples getting married any more than interfaith couples or interracial couples.
Well said. And by the way, I don't bake cakes as a rule, but I eat cakes, and I will eat them on behalf of anybody's celebration. I am absolutely do not discriminate in my endorsement for cakes. Last question, I guess, but is slightly philosophical. I think, but I'd love your thoughts on this. I think we need a revitalized Democratic Party. I think we need a conversation within the Democratic Party. At the same time, this year, as in some other years, but especially this year, we're facing a Republican Party that is so cartoonishly bad, or evil, in my way of putting things, that how do we maintain our internal debate on the left while at the same time making sure that Donald Trump and his minions don't take over the country?
Well, it's going to be, a delicate balancing act. I mean, I think that, to put the second point first, it's a moment of high danger for American society and for world society. There are really troubling trends from around the world. The terrorism, the religious fundamentalism, the fanaticism that's been unleashed, as well as the very ugly forms of racism and statist repression that are emerging in different parts of the world. And so Trump rightfully reaches out to all of his spiritual compatriots like Putin and the right-wing, aspiring autocrats in Europe and so on, and they've all found each other. The bullies all find each other, and so we've got to, the differences within the progressive tent or democratic tent are minuscule compared to what separates us from people who are trafficking in the most dangerous impulses in the world now. That's number one. But number two is, I think we have to recognize that that while Senator Clinton became kind of the center and the center held, the rest of the campaign has been dueling forms of populism. Right-wing populism with Trump blaming immigrants, demonizing minority groups, vilifying Mexicans and Muslims and so on, and progressive or left-wing populism, which has been Bernie Sanders saying that that working people in the middle class have been completely shut down by political and economic, oligopoly in the country. And it's important that the progressive populism come to infuse the Clinton campaign, that those, the center and the progressive parts be married together if we're going to win this election, because we need both parts to win.
I think that's absolutely true. So, listen, Jaime Raskin, congressional candidate in Maryland's 8th District. I got that right?
You got it.
Once again, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Totally my pleasure.